The chains were the first sound I heard every morning. Not the birds in the fields, not the wind through the cypress trees, not even the groan of tired men lifting themselves from the dirt floor of the quarters, but the chains. They rattled with every breath, every shift of the body, every movement we dared to make before dawn. The overseer made certain of that. He said chains taught us to remember who we were, as though the iron biting into my ankles was the only thing keeping me from forgetting I was a slave. But I did not forget. I remembered everything. I remembered the sting of the whip that carved my back when I was no more than 10. I remembered the first time my mother was dragged from the quarters, screaming, and returned hours later silent, broken, her eyes fixed on something that no longer existed in this world. I remembered the smell of blood in the fields, drying under the hot Georgia sun, when the master had one of the men beaten to death for working too slowly. Every memory lived inside me like hot coals, and though I had learned to keep my face still and my voice soft, inside me there was only fire. The plantation was a world of rhythms. The bell clanged before the sun rose, and we shuffled from our huts like ghosts, shoulders bent, eyes lowered. We moved in lines, watched by mounted men with rifles, toward the fields that stretched farther than the eye could see. Cotton fields in every direction, white blooms masking the soil that drank our sweat. By midday our hands would be raw, the nails split, fingers trembling as we stuffed the sacks fuller, faster, always faster. A whip cracked if we slowed, and if we cried out, another would follow to teach us silence. Still, there were moments in that endless suffering when my mind drifted. I would catch the glint of the sun against the overseer's rifle, or the sweat dripping down his face, and I would wonder, did he ever fear the day the slaves might rise? Did he ever imagine what it would look like, the moment his own whip turned against him? I had, many times. But revenge was not something you reached for quickly. It was a fruit that had to ripen in the dark. Every day of submission, every forced bow of the head, every yes, master, was not surrender. It was waiting. It was storing up patience like water behind a dam, until the time came when all that pressure would burst through. Among us, family was the only refuge. My mother, though her body bore the marks of years of cruelty, still hummed soft songs at night. Old words from Africa mixed with prayers she had learned here. My younger sister clung to her side, and I, though older now, leaned into that fragile warmth. In those hours, huddled together while rats skittered through the dirt, we almost believed we were human again. But the world never let us forget otherwise. One night, long after the overseer's lantern had faded from view, a man in the quarters whispered that another family had been sold off that day. A mother dragged to the auction block, her children screaming as men with hard faces counted money and nodded. Sold to another county, maybe another state. Gone forever. The whisper spread like smoke, and we all felt it burn inside our chests. For what were we but bodies to be bought and discarded? That was the truth of shackled life. Nothing belonged to us. Not our names, not our labor, not even our children. Every sunrise was a reminder that the master could take it all without warning. And yet, though they could strip us of everything, we held something they feared, something they could not chain, no matter how heavy the irons, no matter how deep the lashes. We held memory. I carried mine like a hidden blade, each cruelty, each humiliation, each scream torn from someone I loved. I sharpened them inside my mind. They thought they were breaking us, but they were forging something else. On the surface, I moved as they commanded. I bent when ordered, worked when whipped, smiled when forced. But behind my eyes, I kept count. Every blow, every theft of dignity, every drop of blood spilled into the earth. And I swore silently in the quiet of those long nights that the reckoning would come. I did not know when. I did not know how, but I knew that no chain lasts forever. Iron rusts, wood rots, flesh hardens and refuses to yield. And when that day came, when the chains fell, when the whip cracked no more, when the master himself felt the terror he had sown for so long, I would be there, waiting, watching, ready to collect every debt he owed. The master was a man who wore cruelty like a second skin. To the white folks who visited from nearby plantations, he was all charm, laughing too loud, pouring brandy into their cups, boasting about his yields and the fine condition of his stock. But when the guests left and the big house windows went dark, he shed that mask. What lived beneath was something closer to a beast than a man. I saw it in his eyes, small, cold, always searching for something to break. The first lash of his whip came before sunrise one morning, long before we'd reached the fields. A young boy, barely 12, had stumbled in the dark, tripping over the roots near the path. He was thin, ribs like a washboard under his skin. The boy hit the ground, face first in the dirt, And before anyone could help him, the master was there. "Get up," he barked. His voice snapped like the whip itself. The boy scrambled, coughing mud in his mouth. His legs wobbled. He managed only half a rise before the whip whistled through the air and cracked against his back. The sound was worse than the scream, sharp tearing, as though the boy's very flesh had split apart. The master didn't wait for him to stand. He lashed again and again. By the third strike, the boy could do nothing but curl into himself, his cries muffled against the earth. The rest of us stood still, eyes on the ground, throats tight with swallowed rage. To look up even for a second was to invite the same fate. Yet I felt my fists clench around the sack I carried. My nails bit into my palms until they nearly broke skin. "Useless," the master spat. He dropped the whip only to drag the boy upright by the collar. Blood soaked through the child's shirt, spreading fast. The master shoved him back toward the line as if he were no more than livestock. The boy staggered, limped, and then forced himself to walk. His small body shook with each step, but he did not fall again. None of us dared help him. That was the master's way. Make one bleed, and the rest would march silently behind. By midday, the boy was gone, carried off in the wagon, limp as a sack of corn. Dead or alive, no one said. We knew better than to ask. That was just one morning. There were hundreds like it. Sometimes the cruelty came without reason. He would appear in the fields and take aim at whoever's back was nearest, his whip biting deeper each time we flinched. Other times, it was calculated, deliberate. Like when he separated husbands from wives, children from mothers, all because he enjoyed the sound of the wailing. He said it made the fields grow faster, but the worst moments came at night. When the moon was high and silence fell over the quarters, you'd hear the footsteps, boots crushing the dirt, the creak of a door, then muffled screams. A woman dragged from her pallet, forced into the dark. She would return at dawn with hollow eyes, her body trembling, voice broken. And the master, he would stride into the day with a satisfied smile, like a predator who had feasted well. Every act, every scream, every drop of blood that seeped into the ground. I recorded it, not on paper, not in words, but in my chest where it burned hotter than any fire. I thought often of my mother. She used to whisper to me, when I was small, that God was watching, that no cruelty went unseen. She told me to hold faith, to wait for his justice. But waiting had worn me thin. For years I looked to the sky, hoping to see some sign of that justice. For years I bent my knees in prayer, whispering words I half believed, and yet the master still laughed, still whipped, still stole, still destroyed. It was then I understood, if there was to be justice, it would not come from heaven, it would come from my own hands. That thought frightened me at first. A slave was not meant to dream of revenge, not meant to imagine his chains shattering, his master screaming. But I could not unthink it once it entered me. It took root deep and stubborn, sprouting each time the whip cracked, each time the master's boots struck the dirt. He thought we were broken. He thought fear was enough to keep us forever bent. But he was wrong, because beneath every bowed head in the fields lived a soul that remembered freedom. Beneath every scar lived a fury waiting for its moment. And beneath my silence lived a promise that the master's wrath, for all its noise and terror, would one day meet something far greater. And when that day came, I swore I would not look away. I would watch him fall. I would savor the sound. Until then I endured. I worked. I bent. I kept my chains quiet. But in my mind I was already sharpening the blade. If chains were the weight that bound us, family was the thread that held us together. Thin, fragile, easy to snap. But it was all we had. Without it we would have been nothing but shadows in the fields, nameless and hollow. For me that thread was my mother and my younger sister. My father was long gone, sold off before I was old enough to remember the sound of his voice. All I had was scraps of stories my mother whispered when she thought the night safe. She would speak of him as a man who laughed loudly, who carried me on his shoulders in the early mornings before the master tore him away. She spoke of him in present tense, as if saying was, instead of is, would tear her heart open all over again. She clung to those stories, because they were the only proof he had ever lived. My mother was not a tall woman, nor strong by the master's measure, but there was a strength in her the lash could never beat out. When she wrapped her arms around me, when she hummed those low songs at night, the quarters felt less like a cage and more like a home. She was the kind of woman who made you believe, if only for a heartbeat, that there was something worth surviving for. And then there was my sister, barely 13, but already forced to work in the fields alongside us. Her hands were blistered, her shoulders too thin to carry the weight of the sack they strapped to her back. Yet she smiled. Somehow she found a way to laugh, to chase joy where there was none. She would point out a bird circling above the fields, whispering, "That one's free." And for a moment, we could pretend the same of ourselves. It was my duty to protect her. I felt it in my bones. But on the plantation, duty was a fragile dream. You could not protect anyone when even your own body was not yours to command. The master could rip her away at any moment. In the quarters, after long days under the sun, we huddled together, trading stories, prayers, and whispers of places beyond the horizon. My mother taught my sister and me old words, sounds from a language the master had tried to erase. We spoke them softly, tasting them like forbidden fruit, and in those syllables we remembered who we were. The other families did the same. Around the fires, in hushed tones, mothers braided their children's hair, and fathers carved small trinkets from scraps of wood. Symbols, charms, little things that said we exist. Each act of love was rebellion in its own right. But the master despised such bonds. He knew that as long as we loved one another, he had not broken us completely, so he targeted families. He sold off children, separated husbands from wives, and forbade gatherings he thought too joyful. He wanted us divided, afraid to care for one another. He believed chains worked best when there was no hand to hold beside you. I think that is why I loved my mother and sister all the fiercer. Every time I felt my sister's hand slip into mine, every time my mother's voice carried into the night with her low, steady song, I told myself, this is what he cannot take. Even if he tried, even if he ripped us apart as he had ripped so many others, the bond would live in me. Still, that bond came at a cost. Love made every cruelty sharper. When the master struck me, I bled. But when he so much as looked at my sister, something deeper than blood burned inside me. Rage, helplessness, fear. And when my mother's weary eyes met mine after another day of labor, I felt the weight of her unspoken plea. Protect her, protect us. But how could I, chained as I was? That question haunted me more than the lash, more than hunger. I would lie awake, staring at the rafters, listening to the rasp of my sister's breathing beside me, and wonder, what kind of man was I, if I could not keep them safe? It was in those moments that revenge stopped being only about me. At first I had dreamed of my own scars, my own pain repaid. But as the nights wore on, I began to see it differently. Vengeance was no longer just my burden. It was the only shield I had to offer. If I could strike back, if I could hurt the master as he had hurt us, maybe the ghosts of my father, the suffering of my mother, the innocence of my sister would not be for nothing. I began to imagine the day not only as my freedom, but as theirs. The day chains broke, not just from my wrists, but from every hand that still reached for the ones they loved. And so, each morning, when the chains rattled and the overseer barked for us to rise, I took my sister's hand in mine and held it tightly. I let her laughter linger in my ears as we marched to the fields. I let my mother's songs steady my heart, because I knew someday soon the bonds of blood would give me the strength to shatter the bonds of iron. The day had begun like any other, sun climbing slowly over the horizon, the air heavy with the promise of heat. But beneath the routine of labor and quiet obedience, I felt a storm gathering. It was subtle at first. A shift in the air, the glint of sunlight on a blade, the way the overseer's eyes lingered a second too long. I knew the calm would not last. Master Willard had been in an unusual mood that morning, striding through the fields with an air of triumph I could not place. His gait was measured, but every so often he barked orders that seemed almost cruel for the sake of cruelty alone. He was testing us, I realized, seeing how far he could push before we broke. And yet he did not see me, never anyone truly beneath him. He saw only what he wanted: labor, submission, silence. The breaking point for me had not been forged in a single moment, but in a lifetime of them. Every lash, every insult, every stolen moment of tenderness taken from me and my family, it had accumulated inside me, layer upon layer, until it pressed against my ribs like the river against the banks in flood. And now it was close to bursting. I watched as my sister struggled with a sack of cotton, her fingers raw and bleeding. A small oversight, dropping a handful of cotton, would have earned her a whipping. But today my tolerance snapped. I could feel the heat of rage pooling in my stomach, the sharp clarity that comes only when survival is secondary to the need for justice. The overseer approached, cracking his whip lazily, aiming to instill fear. I stepped forward, not in defiance, but in protective instinct. My hand hovered near my sister, ready to pull her back if the lash came down too close. The overseer noticed, of course, and smirked. "So much fire, little use," he muttered under his breath. Then Master Willard appeared. White suit, blazing in the sun, his cane tapping a rhythm of authority across the dirt. His eyes swept over the fields, stopping briefly on me. He nodded in satisfaction, as if seeing a loyal dog at work. My stomach roiled. This man, the architect of so many sorrows, could smile without understanding a single drop of the suffering he had created. I clenched my fists, feeling the leather of the gloves I had been given that morning press into my palms. Every nerve screamed, every muscle tensed. I was not the same man who had arrived in these fields 32 years ago. The boy who had trembled under the whip, who had swallowed fear like water, was gone. I was the sum of every insult, every stolen love, every injustice endured. And the river that had taught me patience now whispered of reckoning. A sudden commotion broke my focus. One of the younger slaves had stumbled, the sack of cotton tearing open and spilling into the dirt. Master Willard's voice rang out, sharp and cruel, demanding punishment. The overseer moved toward the boy with practiced efficiency, whip raised. My decision crystallized in that instant. I could no longer wait. If I faltered, if I hesitated, another day would pass and the same injustices would be repeated. I acted, swiftly, silently, like water finding its path through the smallest crack. I reached for the boy, guiding him out of the line of punishment. The overseer barked, whip slicing the air, but I was already moving, herding him back toward the quarters. Every eye on me, white and black, held a momentary hesitation. They had seen many broken, many compliant. But something in my resolve made them pause. Master Willard's laughter cut through the morning air. "Elijah, you dare." His tone was incredulous, almost amused. The boy cowered behind me, and I could feel the panic and hope mingling in equal measure. The others in the field began to murmur quietly, sensing the shift. This was not just about one boy. This was the breaking point for all of us. I did not answer Master Willard. Words were useless in this moment. Action alone could speak, and so I stood firm. The weight of decades pressing down on my shoulders, the fires of resistance ignited deep within. I felt the eyes of my family on me, my mother, my sister, the others, watching, waiting. The river inside me had risen, relentless and unforgiving, demanding justice, demanding liberation, demanding change. For the first time, I realized that fear could not hold me. That fear had always been a cage, but I had found the key. Rage and sorrow had sharpened my resolve, and the breaking point had arrived. From this day forward, no lash, no insult, no separation would bind me as it had before. I was ready for whatever came next. The overseer's whip hung mid-air, suspended in disbelief. Master Willard's gaze was locked on me, searching for submission and finding none. And in that instant I understood. The river's lesson was clear. Force alone could not contain the currents of justice. Patience had brought me here, and now the moment had come to let it flow. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, turning the fields into a furnace. Sweat stung my eyes, but I welcomed it. Each droplet was a reminder that my body was still mine, even if for a short while, and that the fire inside me had not been quenched. The incident with the boy had set something in motion, subtle yet unmistakable. A tension threading through the plantation like the hum before a storm. Whispers traveled through the rows of cotton, carried on glances, on the shuffle of bare feet against dirt, on the tilt of a head that only those who shared our suffering could read. The overseers tried to maintain control, barking orders that rang hollow. The white men strutted through the fields, pretending everything was normal, but I saw it in their eyes. Unease, a flicker of doubt. The currents of fear were no longer entirely in their hands. I moved deliberately, measuring each step, careful not to draw suspicion yet pushing closer to the edge of defiance. My mind was a river of plans, each branching into another, feeding into a singular purpose. Every conversation, every glance, every motion was a part of a larger design. I was learning the subtle art of influence, of planting seeds without revealing my hand, and the storm, though unseen, was gathering strength. Joseph's presence was a quiet reassurance. He moved among the workers, strong and deliberate, observing, signaling in tiny ways that went unnoticed by our masters. A finger pressed to the chest, a hand brushing the side of a basket. These were our language, our network. Each gesture reminded me that I was not alone, that the currents of rebellion ran deeper than I had dared hope. But the river inside me, the patient, relentless current, whispered caution. The storm could be powerful, but unchecked it could destroy more than it freed. Patience had always been our ally, and now, even as the tension swelled, I tempered my actions with its lesson. Observation, timing, subtlety. These were the tools that would see us through what was to come. Master Willard's second wife flitted among the servants, her gaze sharp and calculating. She had learned to navigate cruelty, but she did not see the undercurrents flowing beneath her feet. I caught her glance once, a flicker of suspicion, quickly masked, but it was enough. I nodded slightly to myself. Every eye that underestimated us made the storm stronger, for they did not realize it had already begun. By midday, the air had thickened with anticipation. The overseers grew restless, their vigilance more erratic as the workers moved with quiet purpose, their bodies obedient but their eyes alert. I passed among them, hands steady, offering small corrections, gentle guidance. Each touch, each word was a signal, a reinforcement of what they already knew but could not act upon openly. The storm was not yet visible, but it hummed beneath the surface, a promise waiting for its moment. Even the Mississippi seemed to respond. From the river's edge, I watched the water glint like silver under the sun, carrying currents too swift to see yet powerful beyond comprehension. The river had taught me patience, strength, and inevitability. It had carried Master Willard in its depths, and now it whispered of the next steps of timing, of precision. The storm, like the river, would not be rushed. It would flow, unstoppable once released. Small acts of resistance rippled through the enslaved people. Tools were misplaced, tasks slowed, glances exchanged with subtle approval. Each gesture was a spark, tiny but bright, feeding the collective energy. The overseers noticed only in fragments, dismissing them as coincidence or carelessness, never recognizing the deliberate coordination behind them. I sought out Sarah during a brief pause, finding her at the edge of the kitchen. Her hands were steady as she kneaded dough, but her eyes met mine with understanding. No words were necessary. The storm was not mine alone to bear, it was ours. Her quiet presence was a bomb, a reminder that the network of resistance extended beyond the fields, reaching into kitchens, cabins, and hidden corners of the plantation. By late afternoon, shadows had grown long, stretching across the fields like dark fingers. I moved among the enslaved workers, whispering prayers older than any church, murmuring guidance carried on the wind. The storm was ready, coiled and patient, awaiting the precise moment when it could erupt. And I knew that moment would come soon. It would demand courage, cunning, and sacrifice. But it would come. Like the Mississippi, it would not be denied. The currents of justice, long held back by fear and cruelty, were swelling, ready to sweep through the plantation and claim what had been owed for generations. I paused at the riverbank, feeling its pulse beneath my feet. It spoke of inevitability, of justice, of the power that lies in patience and resolve. The storm was gathering, both within me and among my people, and when it broke, it would not merely wash over the plantation. It would carve a new course, one shaped by the strength and courage of those who had been denied their freedom for too long. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long, golden fingers across the fields, touching the cotton bolls with a fleeting brilliance. Each shadow seemed to stretch like a warning, a reminder that the day of reckoning approached. I moved through the rows, hands steady, watching faces I knew so well. Every glance, every nod carried meaning in our secret language, but beneath it all was tension. The plantation held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Master Willard had retired to his study hours ago, absorbed in his preparations for tomorrow. He did not suspect the currents gathering beneath his feet. The quiet revolutions whispered through the very soil he thought he controlled. I had completed my tasks under the guise of subservience, masking the torrent of plans that surged within me. Each movement had purpose, each word a careful layer of deception. He could not see me. He had never truly seen me. In the cabins, whispers traveled like smoke, curling through cracks in the walls, carried by those who understood the significance of every gesture. Sarah moved silently among them, her hands deftly arranging herbs and oils, preparing what might be needed, her presence a reassurance. Joseph, scarred but unbowed, oversaw the smaller workers with quiet authority. The smallest gestures, the tilt of a head, a cough, a shift in posture, communicated volume. We were readying not just for survival, but for action, for an assertion of humanity that had been denied for too long. The river called to me. Its currents seemed more insistent than ever, reflecting the fiery orange of the setting sun as it wound toward the horizon. I lingered at the bank, feeling its pulse against my bare feet. Water did not rush. It persisted. It carved its path through stone with patience, with constancy. And tomorrow the river would be more than water. It would be a witness, a partner, an instrument of the reckoning we had long envisioned. I made my way back toward the main house, under the pretense of attending to Master Willard's needs. Each step was measured, deliberate, hiding the tension coiling inside me like a serpent ready to strike. The servants I passed lowered their eyes, yet a flash of recognition in some lingered. a subtle acknowledgement that the moment of transformation was at hand. They too understood the stakes, though few would admit it aloud. In the kitchen, Martha looked up as I entered, her expression guarded yet warm. "Everything will be ready for tomorrow," she said quietly, her voice steady. I nodded, offering no words in return. She understood. She always understood. The preparations were not merely for a baptism. They were the stage for a reckoning that would ripple through the plantation, through the very fabric of what our masters believed they controlled. As dusk fell, the air thickened with expectation. The enslaved choir practiced quietly, their hymns rising and falling in a rhythm both beautiful and ominous. The songs would carry tomorrow's ceremony, voices blending like threads of fate. Each note, each breath carried a weight that the white congregation could not perceive, a meaning that would echo in ways they could never comprehend. I returned to the river for a final moment alone. Kneeling on the bank, I allowed my hands to trail in the water, feeling the cool current slip between my fingers. I whispered words older than the plantation, older than the master's house, words of invocation and protection. The Mississippi had long carried the cries of my people, the unheeded prayers of generations. Tomorrow it would carry more than water. It would carry justice, silent and inexorable. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of evening blooms and the faint tang of the river. I felt the weight of the days to come pressing against me, yet beneath it all was clarity. The ceremony, meant to be a display of obedience and piety, would become something entirely different. Master Willard would enter the river as a symbol of his own arrogance, his assumption of control, and what he thought was his ritual of faith would intersect with the patient, persistent current of truth and retribution. Returning to my quarters, I gathered my thoughts, running through each step of the plan as I moved. Each motion had to be precise, every handhold exact. The moment would demand both patience and resolve, a delicate balance between action and control. Failure was not an option, yet hesitation would be fatal. I prepared my body, my mind, and my spirit. The river would demand it. The generations who had suffered demanded it. The overseers patrolled the grounds with more vigilance than usual, unaware of the currents running beneath their watchful eyes. The enslaved people retreated to their cabins, faces blank yet resolute, hearts beating in silent synchronization. Tomorrow would come, and with it the ceremony. The river awaited, and I, Elijah, stood at the edge of everything, ready to move with it. Dawn crept slowly over the horizon, tinting the cotton fields with muted gold. The Mississippi glimmered faintly in the early light, its surface deceptively calm, hiding currents that could snap trees from the bank if unchecked. I approached the river with the careful quiet of someone carrying a sacred duty, though in truth, the river and I were bound by far deeper understanding than any divine ritual could grant. The assembly was already forming. The white guests had begun arriving, their parasols lifted against the sun, faces polished with expectation. Their clothes were bright, spotless, symbols of wealth and control. Behind them, the enslaved choir gathered in neat rows, dresses and shirts cleaned as best we could manage. Their eyes were empty masks to the world, but mine met several of them, and in those brief connections I saw understanding, a recognition that something monumental was about to unfold. I moved along the water's edge, ostensibly checking the entry points, adjusting ropes and securing small platforms for the ceremony. Every motion was precise, a performance for the overseers and guests, but beneath each action my mind rehearsed the true course of events. The river would carry us, guide us, and conceal our intent until the moment arrived. Water was patient, it did not rush. Its patience was my ally, its constancy my confidant. Martha, the head cook, approached quietly, carrying a small basket of herbs and offerings. She placed them at the edge of the water with a subtle nod, her eyes flicking toward me. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Sarah's preparations from the night before had ensured these items were ready. Together, these offerings formed a silent conduit to the river, an invocation older than any of us, one that would lend strength to what I intended. The overseers lingered near the banks, pretending casual interest while ensuring the enslaved people remained in line. They had no inkling of what was to come. The river itself, carrying centuries of unrecorded grief and suffering, seemed to pulse beneath my feet. I felt its energy, a current as old as the land, as persistent as the pain that had built in the fields and cabins over generations. Reverend Thomas paced near the water, Bible in hand, muttering verses under his breath. He glanced at me, relief evident in his features. "Everything ready?" he asked softly, his voice low enough to reach only me. "Yes, Reverend," I replied. "Master Willard will be arriving shortly." As the choir tuned their voices, I surveyed the river. The water reflected the sunlight like molten silver, and I imagined its depths swallowing more than just one man. It had carried away mothers and children, men and women, souls torn from their families, their pain unseen. Tomorrow, it would bear witness to another act, one of reclamation and justice. I moved to the bank where Master Willard's position would be, ensuring the footing was stable, the water shallow enough for the ceremonial guidance he expected, yet deep enough to conceal the river's patience. Each stone and root I touched, each shift of the sand beneath my feet, was both preparation and meditation. I whispered quietly to the river, words I did not fully understand, calling upon its constancy, its silent judgment, its enduring strength. Joseph appeared at my side, his face drawn but resolute. He gave a subtle nod, our unspoken pact reaffirmed. "Everything is ready," he murmured, voice barely audible. I gave him a slight nod in return. He would not be directly involved, but his vigilance mattered. Others moved in the shadows, ensuring no interruption, ready to observe yet not interfere. The message was clear. Tomorrow's act belonged to the river, to history, and to the spirit of those who had suffered in silence. The white guests continued to chatter, oblivious to the weight of time that had gathered along the banks. Their concerns were superficial, sunlight seating the beauty of the ritual. They did not perceive the undercurrents, the tension in the water, the silent anticipation in the eyes of those who truly understood. I, too, maintained a calm exterior, masking the storm within. I was patient. I had been patient for decades. And tomorrow, the river would repay what centuries had withheld. By late afternoon, Master Willard emerged from the house, impeccably dressed, exuding confidence that bordered on arrogance. Behind him, his family followed, faces polished and expectant, believing themselves participants in a sacred ritual. Their steps echoed against the earth, but they were oblivious to the river beneath their feet, to the eyes that watched and understood, to the currents that awaited the moment to shift. I stepped forward to meet them at the water's edge, my posture deferential, my expression neutral. Beneath the mask, every thought was rehearsed, every muscle prepared. The Mississippi flowed at my feet, patient, persistent, inexorable. It was ready. I was ready. The time had come. The afternoon sun hung high, pressing warmth into my skin as the gathered crowd fell silent. The Mississippi lapped quietly at the riverbank, as if waiting, holding its breath for the moment to come. Master Willard approached the water with a measured dignity, white suit immaculate, polished shoes glinting. Behind him, his family followed, each step rehearsed and deliberate, carrying the same confidence that centuries of privilege had bred. I moved alongside him, careful to keep my movements precise, deferential. Every motion projected obedience, but inside, my mind was focused, calibrated. Today, the river would witness something more than a baptism. It would witness justice long denied. Every step into the water was both literal and symbolic. Each inch deeper was a claim on power as never been permitted before. Reverend Thomas began the ritual, his voice carrying across the river a rhythm of prayers and scripture. White and black faces alike listened, though with vastly different interpretations. The white congregation perceived a ceremony of spiritual renewal. The enslaved choir, dressed in their cleanest clothes, followed the rhythm mechanically, but I knew some heard more, felt more. Every note vibrated in the space between hope and fear, obedience and rebellion. I positioned myself behind Master Willard as he stepped into the current. The water, cool against my calves, whispered in currents only I could feel. My hands rested lightly on his shoulders, a posture of guidance, of service, as if I were aiding him into the waters of spiritual rebirth. And yet beneath that facade, my body remembered every slight, every lash, every injustice he had inflicted. The river and I shared memory, history, and intent. The Reverend raised his hands, calling for solemnity, and the congregation's song softened into a hymn, rising and falling like the river itself. "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior?" the Reverend intoned. Master Willard's voice, confident, clear, answered, "I do." Time slowed, each heartbeat echoing in my ears. My grip on his shoulders remained steady, outwardly gentle, inwardly purposeful. Beneath the surface I calculated, weight distribution, current strength, timing. Every factor had to align. The water was my ally, as patient and consistent as my resolve. I whispered words to it silently, words that traced back through generations, carrying sorrow, anger, and purpose. As the Reverend moved to the final invocation, signaling the descent into the water, I guided Master Willard carefully, ensuring he leaned fully back, ready to be submerged. His trust, born of ignorance, blinded him to the currents beneath the ceremony, the undercurrent of inevitability that flowed through me. The water rose to his waist, then chest, cold and insistent. I adjusted my stance, feeling the river's subtle strength reinforce mine. Beneath its reflective surface, I imagined the countless who had suffered along its banks. Mothers stolen from children, fathers broken in the fields, voices silenced by whips. Today their echoes merged with mine, guiding my hands, reinforcing my patience, my precision. Reverend Thomas spoke the final words of baptism, instructing me to lift Master Willard fully under the water and bring him back up. My outward movements mirrored the ritual exactly. My hands on his shoulders and arms were steady, outwardly obedient. Inwardly, I readied for the shift, the moment when patience would become action. Around us, the congregation sang, some heads bowed, some observing the ritual with the assumption of normalcy. The enslaved choir maintained disciplined posture, but I saw subtle flickers of recognition in their eyes, brief, careful acknowledgement that the river's currents would carry more than spiritual renewal. It would carry reckoning. Master Willard closed his eyes, unaware of the undercurrent of intent behind my hands. I felt the tension in his body, the micro-adjustments, the small breaths taken in expectation of a ritual he believed would reaffirm his faith and control. He did not suspect that control had already shifted. The river knew I knew, and soon he would know as well. Each movement was deliberate, each breath calculated. The Mississippi flowed around us, indifferent yet intimate, an accomplice in patience and inevitability. I felt no fear, only focus, a unity of purpose with the river that had shaped my youth, my anger, my preparation. The hymn rose, carrying voices of hope, obedience, and a quiet undercurrent of revolt threading through the tension in the water. I adjusted my grip, preparing for the final act, the submersion that would redefine the ritual, converting ceremony into judgment. The river, reflecting sunlight in shimmering currents, waited, patient, persistent, eternal, and so did I. The moment had arrived. Master Willard's body trembled under my hands, unaware of the final choice that had already been made. The river's current tugged gently, as if aware of its role in what was to come. I tightened my grip slightly, steadying him for the ritual that would never be ordinary. The congregation's hymn reached a crescendo, their voices rising like the river itself, oblivious to the dark intention threading through the ceremony. As I guided him backward, the water rose to his shoulder. Each step deeper mirrored the symbolic surrender he believed he was making, to God, to faith, to spiritual rebirth. But beneath that surface of devotion was the truth he could never perceive. I controlled the moment. My hands, trained in service and obedience for decades, now wielded authority he had never imagined I could possess. His eyes met mine one final time before the water closed over his head. Confusion and trust waged war in that brief gaze, and I held firm, calm, resolute. The Mississippi, indifferent and eternal, cradled us both in its relentless current. I whispered silent words of power and justice, honoring the pain of countless ancestors who had suffered along these banks. Every muscle in my body remembered, every memory sharpened my purpose. As the Reverend intoned the baptismal words, I guided him fully beneath the surface. Water pressed against my skin, cold, alive, insistent, yet comforting in its unyielding constancy. Beneath the surface, the world dissolved into soundless currents. There were no shouts, no panic, no faces. Just the river and the weight of centuries of oppression flowing through me. His hands flailed briefly, instinctual, ignorant of my control. Each movement was met with steady counterbalance, every resistance accounted for. The current lent its strength, a subtle partner in this act of reclamation. Time slowed, seconds stretching into eternity. I counted them in my mind, precise, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. Each heartbeat a silent testament to what generations of bondage had endured. The bubbles escaping from his nose and mouth rose like tiny confessions, carrying away fragments of arrogance, entitlement, and cruelty. His struggle intensified, the raw panic of a man unaccustomed to being powerless. I felt no exhilaration, no cruelty in the act itself, only the cold clarity of inevitability. Today, the river and I restored a measure of balance to a world long skewed. From the shore, I glimpsed the reactions: confusion, alarm, disbelief painted faces in shock. Overseers hesitated. Unarmed and uncertain, their authority diminished in the face of something they could not immediately control. The white congregation continued to sing, voices faltering only slightly, unaware of the subtle rupture in the ritual. The enslaved choir watched with carefully neutral expressions, their eyes reflecting recognition without compromise. Some caught brief glances of understanding, an acknowledgement of power reclaimed, a silent promise that the story would live beyond this day. Master Willard's struggles weakened. His body, once a symbol of dominance and cruelty, now seemed small, fragile, human. The suit that had gleamed in the sun was heavy and dark in the water, clinging to him like a shroud. Each flailing motion only reaffirmed my control. Every second under the current, a reclamation of dignity denied to so many before him. I whispered to him, words carried beneath the water only by intention, not by sound. The Lord has seen the affliction of his people, the river knows. The river remembers. His eyes, wide with disbelief and terror, met mine one last time. Recognition dawned too late. This was not an accident, not a misstep. Retribution had found form in the ritual he believed sacred, second stretch. The current, the river, the centuries of suffering, and my own resolve merged into a single, inexorable force. And then, finally, it ended. His body slackened, the fight drained away. I held him there a moment longer, ensuring the finality of the act before easing him upward, preparing for the appearance of ritual completion. When his face broke the surface, eyes wide, sightless, mouth open in a silent gasp, the crowd reacted in chaos. Screams erupted, shouts rang out. White hands reached, but too late. The river had already claimed its witness, and I remained calm, the weight of inevitability settling around me. I stepped aside as they dragged him ashore, maintaining the appearance of subservience while my spirit soared free in a way no chain could ever contain. The Mississippi flowed on, indifferent to the mortal panic around it, as it had for centuries, and in that relentless eternal movement, I felt the first flicker of something long denied. Power, choice, freedom, not of the body which would soon suffer, but of the spirit. For a moment, the river and I were aligned unstoppable, carrying the legacy of what had been denied to generations of the enslaved. The chaos on the riverbank unfolded around me, but I moved through it as if detached, a ghost among the living. White women screamed, clutching their skirts, their faces pale with horror. Children cried, confused by the sudden rupture in the ritual they had been taught to revere. Men rushed into the water, splashing awkwardly in their Sunday best, pushing aside anything or anyone in their path. But I made no move to flee. There was nowhere to run that would keep me safe, and strangely, no desire to escape. The Mississippi flowed past, indifferent, unyielding, a silent witness to the culmination of years of suffering. My bloodied hands still gripped the edge of the platform for balance, my body trembling from exertion and the strain of the act I had committed. Around me, the overseers and plantation owners hesitated, uncertain how to act against a slave who had shattered the world they believed immutable. Some reached for whips, others searched for ropes. Confusion reigned, and in that moment I understood that power, true power, was fleeting and fragile, held not in wealth or status but in the courage to seize the moment. Reverend Thomas knelt beside him, praying with a fervor that bordered on hysteria, hands trembling as he beseeched God to undo what could not be undone. White men cursed, gesturing wildly, while the overseers finally realized the gravity of their inaction. They moved toward me, whips raised, fists clenched, but the crowd's chaotic energy slowed their approach. My people remained where they stood, faces carefully blank, hiding pride, fear, or any sign of approval. And yet, in fleeting glances, some acknowledged what had happened, a silent communication I would carry with me even in chains. Pain arrived quickly, as if the universe demanded the proper balance for the life I had taken. Blows rained down, fists and boots striking with calculated force, the leather of whips slicing my back and shoulders. I made no sound, offered no resistance. Pain was familiar, a companion I had known since childhood, and in comparison to the burden of suppressed rage and years of injustice, it was fleeting. Each strike reminded me of what I had endured and yet, paradoxically, of what I had reclaimed. My agency, my will, my humanity. Through swelling eyes, I caught glimpses of my people. Sarah stood among them, her hands clasped as if in prayer, her eyes dry but unwavering. She nodded ever so slightly, an acknowledgement of both what I had done and the role I would play in the story that would be whispered long after this moment. Joseph's back was raw from the whipping he had endured in the aftermath, but he held himself tall, unbroken in spirit. Isaiah and Martha, others I had long known and relied upon, watched silently, understanding in ways that did not need words. They dragged me toward the plantation, each step slow, deliberate, and weighted with both physical pain and symbolic significance. The sun burned overhead, relentless and indifferent, as if mocking the suffering below it. Onlookers, white neighbors and friends, stared, their faces contorted with outrage, disbelief, fear. They had believed themselves untouchable, shielded by the law, the whip, and their perceived superiority. Now uncertainty flickered in their eyes. For a brief, fleeting instant, they glimpsed the consequences of underestimating those they sought to control. The house loomed ahead, its grandeur a cruel reminder of the life Master Willard had built atop the labor and suffering of those he claimed as property. Chains rattled. Shackles bit into my wrists and ankles, each link a reminder of my mortality, a tether to a world that sought to punish me for reclaiming the dignity it had stolen. But inside, beneath the immediate reality of captivity and pain, my spirit remained unbowed. The Mississippi had not abandoned me. The river's flow carried a message far greater than fear, punishment, or death. As I was thrown into the dark confines of the storage shed, alone, bloodied and aching, silence enveloped me. The sounds of frantic debate and planning filtered through the cracks of the wooden wall. Master Willard's family screamed in grief. The overseers argued with one another over how to mete out justice. Plans for a public execution, a spectacle to terrify, were already underway. My own death had been decided before I even drew breath after the act. Yet for all their plotting, I felt a strange calm. Justice had been done, and though my body would suffer, my spirit had been liberated, even if only for a fleeting moment. Through a small crack in the shed, I could see the river, its surface glinting in the sunlight like molten silver. Indifferent to human schemes, it carried the memory of what had transpired, cradling it in its relentless flow. I traced the line of its waters with my eyes, imagining the story that would ripple outward from this day, passed in whispers from cabin to cabin, plantation to plantation. My action had become more than rebellion. It was a seed, a spark that could ignite courage in others long after I was gone. And so, bound, beaten, and confined, I let the river's voice reach me, a steady current of understanding, a reminder that resistance once planted could not be unmade. I had reclaimed something beyond the reach of whips and chains, a truth the masters could neither command nor destroy. My body might soon be broken, but my spirit flowed freely like the Mississippi, uncontainable and eternal. The first night in the shed was suffocating. Darkness pressed in from every side, the air heavy with the smell of damp wood and my own blood. Each shallow breath rasped in my throat, pain flaring with every movement. My wrists throbbed where the shackles had bitten deep, and my back burned from the lashes of the overseer. Yet, the ache of my body was nothing compared to the weight on my spirit, though it was lighter somehow, freer, knowing that I had acted according to my will, that I had carved a moment of justice from a lifetime of oppression. The hours passed with torturous slowness. The sounds outside the shed, the clatter of tools, the raised voices of the plantation owners, the occasional scream of outrage, reminded me that the world had not changed, not really. I was still a prisoner, still at the mercy of those who believed themselves gods over men's lives. Fever set in, bringing with it delirium and visions. Shadows on the wall shifted into faces of my past. My mother, my father, friends I had lost to sail and disease. They spoke without words, their gazes filled with questions I could not answer, with sorrow I could not assuage. Then, just as the edge of my consciousness threatened to dissolve entirely into the haze of pain and fever, a familiar silhouette appeared in the darkness. A soft click marked the shed door opening, and a rush of cool night air followed. My heart leapt. I tensed instinctively, expecting the overseers or worse, but it was not them. It was Sarah. She moved quietly, her body low, her steps measured. "Elijah," she whispered, kneeling beside me. Her presence alone brought a strange comfort, as if the world's edges had softened for a fleeting moment. I croaked, my voice raw from disuse and thirst. "Sarah, you shouldn't—" "Hush," she interrupted, pressing a cool cloth to my fevered forehead. The touch was gentle, familiar, and in that simple act, I felt the bonds of isolation ease slightly. "They're all gathered at the big house, arguing over what's to be done with you. We don't have much time." She uncorked a small gourd and held it to my lips. The water inside was cool and sweet, a balm to my burning throat. Each sip seemed to wash away a fragment of pain, a reminder that someone still cared, that I was not completely alone. Once I had drunk my fill, she tended to my wounds with practiced efficiency, mixing a poultice of herbs and river mud, applying it with deliberate gentleness. The pungent smell was unpleasant, but it was medicine, and I felt its effect almost immediately. "They've decided," she said, her fingers working deftly. "Tomorrow at noon, they're building the platform beneath the oak at the crossroads." My chest tightened at the confirmation. The oak was infamous. A public execution site visible to any traveler along the main road. It would be a warning, meant to terrorize, meant to erase the memory of what I had done before it could inspire anyone else. I asked about the others. My voice horse. Have they suffered for what I did? Sarah paused, her hand stilling for a moment. There have been questions, accusations, but nothing provable. The white folks are too afraid to punish everyone. They need us to harvest their crops, but they watch more closely now. No gatherings, no talking in groups. Joseph was whipped, she continued softly. Not for you, they said, but for being slow in his work. He didn't cry, not once. Afterward, he told me to tell you he regrets nothing. My throat tightened at the news. Joseph, who had stood silently beside me, who had whispered words of caution about the river, had endured pain for his subtle support of my actions. And yet, in that suffering there was dignity, a proof that our resistance was not mine alone. It was ours, collective and unbroken. Sarah's hands resumed their work. Isaiah and the others, safe for now, she murmured. Master Willard's son would take charge tomorrow, but the threat of reprisal loomed over everyone. I understood the unspoken truth. My death would not erase the lesson, but it would certainly bring pain to those around me. I caught her hand in mine, desperate to anchor myself to the living. Sarah, I want you to know. I know, she interrupted, gently, confidently. I've always known Elijah. Since you were a boy, I saw something in you that was different. A fire that wouldn't be quenched, a spirit like the river itself. Her eyes held mine, unwavering. What you did, it wasn't right or wrong. It was necessary, like a storm clearing the air even as it destroyed. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling around us. Outside, the distant hammering of the gallows reminded me of the world waiting beyond the shed walls. Sarah pressed something hard into my palm, a smooth riverstone worn by years of current. Keep this, she said softly. When the time comes, remember, water never truly dies. It only changes form. Before I could respond, she slipped away, leaving me alone with the darkness, the pain, and the stone pressed against my palm. Its cool weight was a small comfort, a talisman against fear, a reminder that even in chains, even facing death, I carried something beyond the reach of whips and ropes, the enduring spirit of the river, and the quiet knowledge that resistance, once planted, could never be extinguished. The remainder of the night passed in fitful sleep. My dreams were flooded with water and fire, faces both known and strange. I saw Master Willard beneath the river's surface, no longer terrified but peaceful, as if he had found a truth that eluded him in life. I saw my parents beckoning from distant shores. I saw children yet unborn, carrying the memory of rebellion in their blood. When dawn broke, filtering through the cracks of the shed walls, I was ready. Sarah's ministrations had given me strength to face what awaited me, and the stone in my hand reminded me that some forces, like the river and justice itself, could not be contained. The morning sun struck without mercy, heating the dirt and raising the dust in waves as they dragged me from the shed. My legs were barely able to carry my weight, yet they forced me to walk, each step a reminder of the punishment to come. 6 men surrounded me, including the new overseer appointed by Master Willard's eldest son, his eyes hard with a mixture of curiosity and suppressed satisfaction. Whips and fists were close at hand, ready to enforce submission at the slightest falter. We passed the slave quarters first, and I caught glimpses of those who had survived the terror of the past few days. My people's faces were downcast, their eyes averted, but subtle gestures betrayed their awareness. Fingers pressed lightly to chests, whispers carried on the wind, eyes lingering just long enough to pass unobserved messages of defiance and pride. Each fleeting connection strengthened me. They would remember, and in that remembrance, my act of rebellion would live beyond me. The oak tree loomed in the distance, its massive branches spread wide like a sentinel over the crossroads. Beneath it, a platform had been constructed, a stage of judgment built to display the consequences of defiance. Travelers along the main road would bear witness, ensuring that my execution served as a warning. The crowd was already gathering, white faces filled with righteous anger, black faces carefully neutral, maintaining the thin veneer of obedience demanded by survival. I was forced to climb the platform steps, each movement painful, my muscles trembling from fatigue, injury, and fever. At the top, I faced my accusers, Master Willard's son, Bible in hand, his expression a twisted mirror of what he thought justice should look like. Reverend Thomas stood beside him, his face pale and shaken, likely questioning the very faith he had once wielded to control us. Elijah, the young master, began, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly, "You have committed the most heinous crime imaginable. You have betrayed the trust of a good Christian man, your lawful master, and taken his life in an act of cold-blooded murder." I said nothing. Words meant nothing here. In their eyes, I was property that had failed, a tool that had turned against its user. Any explanation of justice, any argument of revenge long overdue, would fall on deaf ears. No bridge could span the chasm between their world and mine. Before the noose could claim me, the Reverend offered one last chance. "Elijah," he said, opening his Bible with trembling hands, "do you repent of your sin and seek mercy from your Creator?" I met his gaze, my voice rough from disuse but carrying clearly over the silent crowd. "I have prayed each day and night since I was old enough to understand words. I have asked God why his children suffer under the lash, why mothers are separated from their babies, why men made in his image are treated worse than animals. I am still waiting for his answer." A murmur ran through the crowd. The Reverend stepped back, genuinely unsettled. Faith was meant to comfort, to reassure that all was as it should be. My questions tore through that foundation. The young master raised his hand, signaling the men with ropes to proceed. The noose was placed around my neck, tight, unyielding. My body shivered, not from fear but from the final release of tension and preparation. Beyond the white faces filled with anger and judgment, beyond the silent, controlled expressions of my people, I saw the Mississippi glinting in the distance. Its waters had given me courage when I had none. The river had been my partner, and in its memory I found serenity. "Water never truly dies," Sarah had said. "It only changes form." Perhaps justice was the same. It flowed through generations, finding new channels, manifesting in unexpected ways. I felt a strange pity for the young master and those like him. They believed themselves untouchable. Yet their world depended on fear, chains, and the illusion of power. Their might was fragile, their dominion temporary. I closed my eyes, feeling the rough wood of the platform beneath my feet, the cool riverstone hidden in my palm. I sent a silent message to those I left behind. The spirit of resistance endures. The river and I had shared a secret, a covenant of justice that no whip, no rope, no law could undo. The platform dropped away beneath me. Pain flared, searing, and then receded into a distant hum as darkness crept in from the edges of my vision. In those final moments of consciousness, I felt neither fear nor regret. I had acted, I had asserted my humanity, and I had ignited a spark that would never be extinguished. The river's voice echoed in my mind, eternal, unyielding, and welcoming me home. Darkness had settled over the plantation by the time my body was finally removed from the platform. Pain radiated in waves, each one a cruel reminder of the beating, the fall, the noose. They tossed me into the storage shed like I was nothing more than a broken tool, a piece of property no longer of use. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of earth and decay mixing with the tang of sweat. I lay there, body battered, face swollen, wounds still raw, and yet a strange calm settled over me. Through a crack in the wooden walls, I could hear the chaos outside. Plantation owners argued heatedly, their voices sharp and laced with fear. What had begun as outrage had become panic. The foundations of their world had been shaken. One of their own, a master, had been taken by a man they considered property. And though they sought vengeance, they also feared the message that lingered in the Mississippi waters, and in my act, even the powerless could act. The next 3 days passed in a haze of darkness and pain. Chained, malnourished, left with irregular water and food, I drifted in and out of consciousness. Fever took hold, pulling me into visions that blurred the lines between memory and prophecy. My mother appeared young and unlined, placing her cool hand on my burning forehead. Though her lips never moved, her presence spoke volume. She reminded me of the blood, sweat, and tears that had carried our family through generations, of the resilience that lived within us, despite every attempt to break it. The river came to me in these dreams, not as water, but as a woman with eyes dark as midnight, skin polished like the stones she carried downstream. She moved with an elegant strength, at times comforting, at times terrifying, as if reminding me that power and justice flowed in forms older than laws, older than masters. "You are mine now," she seemed to whisper, her voice blending with the current. "You have always been mine." On the third night, I awoke to the soft sound of the shed door creaking. Sarah entered silent, familiar, her presence as reassuring as the Mississippi itself. Kneeling beside me, she pressed a cool cloth to my forehead, the water inside a small gourd easing my burning throat. She tended my wounds with quiet efficiency, her hands skilled and steady. "They've decided," she said, her voice low. "Tomorrow at noon, the oak. The platform is ready." I nodded, unsurprised. The oak had always been the plantation's warning post, a place where justice, or what the masters deemed justice, was meted out. But despite knowing the inevitable, my thoughts drifted elsewhere. Had my actions inspired fear or something deeper, hope. I could feel the eyes of my people, each subtle gesture and whispered word a testament to understanding, to solidarity. They watch us more closely now, Sarah continued, as she applied herbs and mud to my wounds. No gatherings, no talking, but they need us to bring in the harvest. They cannot punish all, though they would if they could. Joseph had suffered, whipped for reasons thinly veiled as labor failures. He had endured silently, his pride intact, his spirit unbroken. His eyes met mine once, a fleeting connection that said all the words we couldn't speak aloud. Tell him, he had said later, I regret nothing. Even in my weakened state, I understood. My act of defiance carried consequences beyond my own body. The risk we all faced was immense, but so was the seed I had planted. It would grow in whispers, passed from cabin to cabin, plantation to plantation. What the masters labeled murder became, in the hearts of the enslaved, an act of courage and rebellion, a reminder that even the most unyielding chains could be challenged. As dawn approached, I felt Sarah's touch once more, pressing the river stone into my hand. Keep this, she whispered. Water never dies, it only changes form. Remember this when the time comes. That small stone, cool against my skin, became a talisman against fear, a reminder that resistance, like water, finds a way to persist. Through the long hours of darkness, I dreamt of the future. Children carrying whispers of courage in their blood. Communities strengthened by shared defiance, rivers flowing with the memory of our resilience. I saw faces of the enslaved, young and old, standing silently but proud, bearing witness to the impossible. The world beyond the plantation would not see the significance of what had happened, but within our communities, the story would endure. By the time the overseers returned, their voices sharp and cruel, the whispers had already begun. In cabins, kitchens, and fields, subtle gestures communicated the truth. Rebellion was possible. Power could be challenged. Fear could be transformed into courage. My body would suffer, but my spirit and the memory of this moment would live. Elijah of Louisiana, executed at the oak, would become more than a man. He would become a story, a lesson, a spark. And though chains could bind bodies, they could not bind hearts or memory. The Mississippi flowed on eternal, as did the legacy of those who dared to defy, quietly but irrevocably changing the currents of history. The sun rose, merciless and bright, casting harsh shadows across the plantation as the overseers dragged me from the shed. My legs, still weak from fever and injury, trembled beneath my weight, but they forced me forward without mercy. The white men's faces were masks of fury, fear, and disbelief, their hands gripping my arms, shoving me along the dirt paths. Every step was a reminder of the brutal price of defiance, and yet with each step I felt a strange sense of pride, knowing what I had set in motion could not be undone. The enslaved gathered quietly in their cabins and fields, faces deliberately blank, eyes cast downward, but subtle gestures betrayed their awareness. A nod held just long enough to be seen, a hand pressed over the heart, a brief glance that carried 1,000 words. They watched, silent witnesses to my fate, and I recognized in them a kind of understanding that transcended words. This was no longer my act alone. It was theirs too, shared through the unspoken language of survival and rebellion. The platform beneath the great oak awaited. Its rough-hewn planks gleamed in the morning light, a cruel stage for what was to come. The overseers' ropes and chains glinted, tools of control sharpened by centuries of fear. As they forced me up the steps, I caught Sarah's eyes among the crowd. She stood tall, unflinching, her presence a quiet defiance. Joseph, raw back from his whipping, held his gaze on me, silent but resolute. Their strength bolstered mine even as my body weakened. Master Willard's son, newly in charge, stood on the platform, Bible in hand, a young man already carrying the weight of his father's cruelty. His voice, though firm, trembled slightly as he addressed the gathered crowd. He framed my act as an unthinkable betrayal, a violation of God's law, and a direct affront to the natural order. The white congregation, outraged, echoed his condemnation, their fear now laced with a creeping suspicion. If Elijah could act, who else might? The overseers and armed men positioned themselves around the platform, ready to enforce the punishment that had been debated and planned over the past days. Every eye was fixed on me, every movement scrutinized. I felt the heat of their hatred, the sharp anticipation of pain, and yet my spirit remained unshaken. My body would suffer, yes, but the rebellion I had set in motion was already alive, flowing like the Mississippi itself through the hearts and minds of those who had watched me, silently, courageously. The noose was secured around my neck, its coarse fibers dug into my skin, a reminder of the immediate danger, but also of the chains I had metaphorically broken long before this moment. Reverend Thomas stepped forward, his Bible open, his voice trembling as he asked if I repented. I spoke clearly despite my raw throat. I asked aloud the questions I had long carried in my heart. Why must God's children endure such suffering? Why are mothers torn from their children? Why are men treated worse than animals? A murmur rippled through the crowd. The young master hesitated, unsure how to respond. The elders among the white spectators stiffened, their own faith shaken by a truth they had never been forced to confront. And among the enslaved, a quiet realization spread. Defiance was possible. Fear could be tempered by courage. Power could be challenged, even if at great cost. As the platform dropped, pain seared through my body, but my eyes found Sarah and Joseph once more. Their faces held no fear, only recognition, pride, and an unspoken promise that the story would endure. Even in death, my act would ripple outward. It would live in whispers, in the careful glances exchanged in the fields, in the subtle teachings passed from elder to child. In the days that followed, the plantation was a tinderbox of tension and fear. Overseers doubled their vigilance. Gatherings were prohibited, and yet the story of what I had done could not be fully suppressed. In the quiet of cabins and kitchens, among the workers in fields and on riverbanks, the tale spread, emblazoned not with condemnation but with courage. Elijah of Louisiana became a name that carried weight, a symbol of the audacity that even the most oppressed could claim power, even if for a fleeting sacred moment. Some fled emboldened by the knowledge that resistance was possible, attempting escape along the river or through hidden routes. Others whispered, passing news of my actions to neighboring plantations, sharing strategies and hope. The masters tightened their control, but the seed had been planted. Fear could not undo what had already taken root. Even those who remained, shackled and watched, carried a spark within them that could not be extinguished. My act of defiance became a story, a quiet rebellion, a testament that even under the whip, even under chains, the human spirit could assert itself. And as the Mississippi flowed past the plantation, constant and indifferent, it carried with it the memory of what had happened, the whisper of resistance that would endure, even as centuries of oppression pressed on. In this way, my story became larger than my body, larger than the punishment, larger than the plantation. It became a symbol, a lesson, a river of courage flowing silently, relentlessly through the lives of those who would come after, transforming despair into possibility, chains into resolve, and fear into whispered resistance. The noose pressed against my neck, rough and unyielding, but my mind was no longer in the present. It drifted, carried like a leaf along the Mississippi, past the chaos of the plantation, past the faces of the fearful white congregation, past the overseer's furious shouts. My spirit traveled into the whispers that had already begun circulating among my people. Each hushed telling, each clandestine nod of understanding, was a pulse of life, proof that my action had not died with me. I thought of the river stone Sarah had pressed into my palm, smooth and cool even beneath the weight of my body. Water never truly dies, she had said. It only changes form. And perhaps resistance, too, only changed form, flowing from one person to another, sometimes quietly, sometimes in moments of explosive courage. I pictured the faces of those who had watched me in the Mississippi, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, and knew they would carry my story forward, even under the threat of punishment. The platform beneath me shifted, and I felt the tension in the rope that was meant to claim my body, but could not touch the truth I had sown. My life would end, yes, but the defiance I had shown would not. It had already leaped from my heart to the hearts of others, unseen yet undeniable. I imagined Joseph, his back raw but his spirit unbroken, whispering my tale to others, keeping alive a fire that could no longer be doused. Sarah ever vigilant, passing the story along, ensuring the memory of the river's justice and our collective courage would not be forgotten. Even as my body swung, suspended in the sun, I felt a strange liberation. The physical pain, the merciless judgment of the young master and his overseers, the finality of death. It all mattered less than the knowledge that I had acted. I had transformed a ritual meant to reinforce submission into a moment of reclamation, a baptism not of the flesh but of justice. And now, as my body became a warning, my spirit became a message. In the weeks and months that followed, the plantation changed in subtle but profound ways. Some fled, inspired by my act, seeking freedom along riverbanks or into swamps, risking everything for the taste of liberty I had glimpsed. Others, still bound by circumstance, carried my story silently, allowing it to ripple through the cabins, the fields, the kitchens, wherever our lives intersected with survival. Fear remained, of course, fear sharpened by the punishment I had endured. But so too did a new courage, one that understood that oppression could be challenged, that the master's power was neither absolute nor eternal. The elders told the tale in hushed tones, careful to avoid prying ears, and it spread beyond the plantation's boundary. My name became shorthand for the audacity to act, the insistence on human dignity, the assertion that even the powerless could strike back, if only for a moment, against centuries of cruelty. Children born after my death would grow up hearing whispers of the baptizer, the man who had turned a sacred ritual into an act of revolutionary justice. And in those whispers lived hope, a hope that could not be chained, a hope that could not be silenced. I understood then fully that resistance need not always be immediate or complete. The smallest act, when carried with intent and courage, could set in motion waves that no overseer, no law, no whip could fully contain. My execution, meant to terrorize and erase, instead became a catalyst for awareness, for vigilance, for subtle rebellion. The Mississippi flowed, carrying my story, carrying their tears, carrying the unbroken resilience of generations. Its waters, indifferent yet enduring, became a mirror of the struggle itself, persistent, unrelenting, and eternal. As my consciousness faded, I felt a kinship with all those who had come before me, whose lives had been shaped by chains and labor, yet whose spirits remained unbroken. Their suffering had been the river, shaping the landscape of oppression, and my act had been the stone thrown into its current, small perhaps in the eyes of the powerful, but enough to ripple outward. I had become part of a continuum of resistance, one that would not end with my death. Even in the final moments, I felt no regret. There was only clarity, a deep understanding of the delicate balance between power and defiance, oppression and freedom, life and memory. The river, the Mississippi, would continue to flow, but it would carry with it a story of courage, of vengeance, of reclamation. Those who heard it remembered it, and passed it on ensured that I was never truly gone. And so, though the rope around my neck claimed my body, it could not claim my spirit. Though the plantation sought to erase me, they could not erase the truth that even the most oppressed could act, could resist, could claim power, however fleetingly, over those who had ruled them with cruelty. Elijah of Louisiana, the baptizer, became more than a man. He became a symbol, a spark, a river of defiance flowing endlessly through time. The Mississippi whispered my legacy. My people carried it in their heart. And for all who would come after, it remained a testament. Oppression can bind the body, but the spirit remains free. Resistance is eternal, courage is unyielding, and hope, even when born from suffering, is indestructible.